No distress call, no Mayday, no warning. 29 men, gone in under 60 seconds. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was 729 feet of American steel, the largest vessel ever to sail the Great Lakes. On the night of November 10th, 1975, it vanished from radar mid-sentence, carrying a full crew and 26,000 tons of cargo. The last words from its bridge were calm, almost routine. The Coast Guard filed its report. The lake filed nothing. Why did no one aboard reach for a single life jacket? The Edmund Fitzgerald was not a reckless vessel. It had sailed Lake Superior more than 700 times since its launch in June of 1958. Christened at the River Rouge shipyard in Michigan with a bottle of champagne and a crowd of several thousand, the ship had been built to a scale that felt impossible for fresh water. Its hull stretched the length of 2.5 city blocks. Its cargo holds could swallow 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, the processed iron ore that fed the furnaces of Detroit and Cleveland. When it moved through the locks at Sault Ste. Marie, it left barely 18 inches of clearance on either side. By 1975, the Fitzgerald was aging but reliable. Its captain, Ernest McSorley, had spent 44 years sailing the Great Lakes. He had earned a reputation among fellow mariners as a careful, methodical man, not given to unnecessary risk, not prone to bravado. On the morning of November 9th, he loaded his cargo in Superior, Wisconsin, over 26,000 tons of taconite, bound for the Zug Island steel plant near Detroit. The weather reports were already showing a pressure system building over the western plains. McSorley watched the forecasts. He decided the Fitzgerald would sail. By late afternoon on November 9th, the National Weather Service had upgraded the incoming system to a full storm warning. Winds were projected to exceed 50 knots. Wave heights on Lake Superior, already a body of water known for its violence, were expected to reach 12 to 15 feet. McSorley contacted the SS Arthur M. Anderson, a similar freighter sailing roughly 10 miles behind, and the two captains agreed to stay close and monitor conditions together. It was standard practice. It had worked before. What neither captain could fully account for was the geometry of the lake itself. Lake Superior is not an ocean. It is 600 miles long and 160 miles wide, enclosed on all sides by land. When a storm moves across its surface, waves do not travel in long, rolling swells that give a ship time to rise and fall. They compress, they steepen. In open ocean, a 10-foot wave might have a wavelength of several hundred feet, giving a vessel time to climb its face and descend the other side. On Lake Superior, that same energy is packed into a wave that rises faster, breaks harder, and offers a steel hull almost no time to respond. Sailors who worked the lakes their whole lives called November storms a different category of danger. Not worse than the ocean, differently lethal. Through the night of November 9th and into the morning of November 10th, the Fitzgerald pushed northeast along the Canadian shoreline, following a route McSorley had chosen to gain some shelter from the building winds. It did not help enough. By mid-morning, the storm had rotated and intensified beyond forecast. Winds were now recorded at over 60 knots. Waves were reaching 20 feet. The Anderson, trailing behind, reported that conditions were among the worst its crew had ever experienced on the lakes. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon of November 10th, McSorley radioed the Anderson with information that should have been the first signal of a crisis already underway. The Fitzgerald had sustained damage. 2 ballast tank vents had been lost, hatches on the deck designed to allow air in and out of the ship's ballast system as it took on and released water for stability. Without them, water could enter compartments that were meant to stay dry. McSorley also reported that the ship was listing slightly to one side. He used the word adornando, a term mariners use for a vessel that has developed an uneven lean. He told the Anderson the ship was taking on water, but that he had the pumps working. His tone, by all accounts from the Anderson's crew, was controlled. He did not request assistance. He did not declare an emergency. He said they were holding their own. What the crew of the Anderson could see from their bridge told a different story. The Fitzgerald had turned off its radar, damaged, McSorley explained, in the storm. The Anderson's crew was now serving as the Fitzgerald's eyes, relaying navigation information across the radio. The giant ship ahead of them was sailing blind through one of the most dangerous stretches of Lake Superior, in conditions that were still deteriorating. And yet McSorley's voice on the radio remained measured, professional. The voice of a man who had sailed through bad weather before and expected to sail through it again. The last recorded transmission from the SS Edmund Fitzgerald came at 7:10 in the evening. The Anderson's first mate, Morgan Clark, had radioed ahead to warn McSorley about a vessel showing on their radar crossing their path. McSorley acknowledged it. He said, "We are holding our own." 4 words. The radio went quiet. Clark waited for a follow-up. Nothing came. He tried to raise the Fitzgerald again. No answer. He tried a third time, then a fourth. The frequency returned only static and the sound of wind. At 7:15, the Anderson's radar showed the return signal from the Fitzgerald's hull disappear. Not fade, not drift off course. Disappear. One sweep of the radar. The ship was there. The next sweep, it was gone. In the space of the time it takes a radar antenna to complete one rotation, roughly 3 seconds, 29 men and 729 feet of steel had ceased to exist on the surface of the lake. Morgan Clark stared at the screen. Then he picked up the radio and began calling for any vessel in the area. The Fitzgerald did not answer. It never would. The Anderson turned toward the last known position of the Fitzgerald and sailed into the storm. What its crew found on the surface of Lake Superior in the hours that followed was not wreckage in the way most people imagine wreckage. There was no debris field that told a coherent story, no lifeboats, no life rings deployed, no survival suits inflated in the water. What floated in the beam of the Anderson's searchlights that night were scattered objects. A lifeboat crushed rather than launched, its hull folded inward by pressure rather than impact. Pieces of the ship's wooden lifeboats shattered. An inflatable life raft, still in its canister, never opened. A few cork life preservers. No bodies. The absence of survival equipment was not random. It was a record. Every object recovered from the surface pointed to the same conclusion. No one aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald had time to reach for anything. The life raft had not been released. The cork rings had not been grabbed from their brackets. The enclosed steel lifeboats, which required deliberate mechanical action to lower into the water, had not been lowered. In a ship of 29 men, with a crew that included officers trained in emergency procedures, not one person had performed a single act of survival preparation before the vessel went under. Maritime investigators studying the recovery report would later note that this pattern was consistent with what engineers call a catastrophic and nearly instantaneous loss of buoyancy. In plain terms, the ship sank so fast that from the perspective of the men aboard, it did not sink at all. One moment they were on a ship, the next moment they were not. The interval between those two states was measured not in minutes, but in seconds. The search for the wreck itself began in earnest the following spring. In May of 1976, the US Navy deployed a remotely operated vehicle called the Curvy 3, a tethered submersible previously used to recover a lost hydrogen bomb off the coast of Spain, to map the floor of Lake Superior at the coordinates where the Fitzgerald had vanished. What the sonar and cameras revealed confirmed the speed and violence of the sinking. The ship had not settled to the bottom intact. It had struck the lake floor with enough force to drive its bow section 15 feet into the sediment. The hull had broken in two. The stern section lay upside down, its propeller pointing skyward at a depth of 530 feet. The separation point between the two sections showed metal that had been torn rather than cut. Jagged edges, consistent with a catastrophic structural failure under extreme stress, not a slow, progressive flooding. The distance between the bow and stern sections on the lake floor was approximately 170 feet. For a ship 729 feet long, that gap told investigators something important. The two halves had not drifted apart over time. They had separated in motion while the ship was still moving forward, possibly still partially above the surface. The Fitzgerald had broken apart before it finished sinking. In July of 1977, the United States Coast Guard released its official report on the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The report ran to dozens of pages and examined every element of the vessel's final voyage. Weather data, cargo records, radio transcripts, sonar imaging, metallurgical analysis of the recovered hull fragments. Its conclusion assigned primary responsibility to the flooding of the cargo hold through the hatch covers, the large steel panels that sealed the openings through which taconite was loaded. The report argued that the hatch covers, which were secured by a system of clamps and gaskets, had failed in the extreme sea conditions, allowing water to pour into the hold in quantities that overwhelmed the ship's pumps and gradually destroyed its buoyancy. The report was immediately and forcefully rejected by a significant portion of the maritime community, particularly among sailors who had spent their careers on the Great Lakes. Their objection was not to the conclusion that water had entered the ship. Their objection was to the explanation of how. The hatch cover design used on the Fitzgerald and dozens of similar lake freighters was standard across the industry. It had been approved and certified by the American Bureau of Shipping. If hatch cover failure was the cause, then every freighter on the Great Lakes was sailing with a potentially lethal flaw, a conclusion the shipping industry and its insurers were deeply reluctant to accept. The Lake Carriers Association, representing the owners of American Great Lakes vessels, commissioned its own investigation. Its report reached a different conclusion. The association argued that the Fitzgerald had grounded on a shallow reef known as 6 Fathom Shoal, located near Caribou Island on the Canadian side of the lake. The ship's radar was damaged, and McSorley was navigating partly by information relayed from the Anderson. If the Fitzgerald's plotted course had placed it closer to Caribou Island than intended, it was possible the hull had scraped the shoal, an underwater shelf rising to within 6 fathoms, or 36 feet, of the surface. A grounding at that depth, at the Fitzgerald's speed, could have buckled hull plates below the waterline without producing an obvious impact that the crew would have recognized as catastrophic. The ship would have continued sailing. The flooding would have been invisible. By the time McSorley transmitted his last message, the Fitzgerald may already have been doomed without anyone aboard knowing it. Neither theory could be conclusively proven. The wreck lay in Canadian waters, and the Canadian government declined to grant permission for a more invasive investigation of the hull. The torn metal at the breakpoint, which might have revealed whether the failure had begun from the outside or the inside, remained on the bottom of Lake Superior, 300 meters below the surface, inaccessible to the instruments that could have answered the question. What the official record could not explain, and what both investigations ultimately skirted around, was the question of time. The Coast Guard's hatch cover theory required water to enter the hold gradually enough to allow the ship to remain afloat through hours of storm conditions, and then suddenly and completely overwhelm its buoyancy in a matter of seconds. The shoal grounding theory required a hull breach large enough to flood a ship of the Fitzgerald size to the point of sinking in under 5 minutes, without the crew detecting any change in the vessel's behavior severe enough to prompt an emergency call. Either way, the math of the sinking demanded a speed that conventional flooding models struggled to account for. The answer, when investigators began to look at it seriously, did not come from the wreck. It came from the water above it. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. It holds 10% of all the surface fresh water on Earth. It is, in every practical sense, an inland sea. But it is not an ocean, and that distinction is the key to understanding what killed the Edmund Fitzgerald on the night of November 10, 1975. In open ocean, a storm builds waves over thousands of miles of uninterrupted water. Those waves grow long and gradual. A freighter riding a 30-foot ocean swell climbs a face that may stretch 500 feet from trough to crest. The ship has time to rise, crest, and descend. On Lake Superior, the fetch is roughly 600 miles. That is enough to generate dangerous wave heights. Investigators recorded swells of 22 to 28 feet during the storm, but not enough to generate equivalent wave length. The energy is the same. The space it occupies is not. What results is a wave that is steep, tall relative to its length, rising sharply and breaking fast. A freighter cannot climb a steep wave the way it climbs an ocean swell. The bow strikes the face rather than riding it. The forces are sudden and concentrated. For a ship the length of the Fitzgerald, this geometry created a specific and well-documented hazard. A vessel longer than the wavelength of surrounding waves will have portions of its hull supported by water, while other portions hang suspended in air between crests. This condition, known among naval architects as hogging and sagging, places enormous stress on the structural members running along the ship's keel. The hull bends. On a well-maintained ship within design tolerances, this bending is acceptable. On an aging ship carrying a full load of dense cargo, in waves steep enough to maximize the unsupported span, the bending can exceed what the steel was built to absorb. The Fitzgerald was 17 years old in 1975. It had been modified and extended since its original construction, lengthened to increase cargo capacity in a procedure common to Great Lakes freighters of its era. Its inspection records showed it had passed all required certifications. But those certifications measured the ship against standards for typical conditions. They were not designed for the worst storm recorded on Lake Superior in decades, nor for seas that the Anderson's crew would later call the most extreme of their careers. Several maritime engineers who studied the case in the years following the sinking put forward a third theory, distinct from both the Coast Guard's hatch cover conclusion and the Lake Carriers Association's shoal grounding argument. Their hypothesis centered on a phenomenon that sailors on the Great Lakes had named, but that formal naval engineering had only recently begun to model mathematically. They called it the Three Sisters. The Three Sisters was not, in the strictest sense, a legend. It was a description of a wave formation that occurred under specific meteorological conditions that were present on Lake Superior on the night of November 10th. When a storm rotates and its wind direction shifts rapidly, it can generate a secondary wave train running at an angle to the primary swell. Under the right circumstances, these two wave systems interact to produce a sequence of three anomalously large waves arriving in rapid succession, each separated by a trough far shorter than normal. A ship striking the first wave has its bow driven down. Before the bow can rise, the second wave arrives, driving it further. The third wave finds the bow already partially submerged. The result is a phenomenon engineers call bow diving. The forward section of the vessel plunges below the surface under a weight of water it cannot shed fast enough, and the ship's own momentum carries it downward. The Fitzgerald's forward deck, where the damaged ballast vents were located, sat lower in the water than it would have under normal loaded conditions. McSorley's report of a slight list at 3:30 in the afternoon suggested that some flooding had already occurred by mid-afternoon, hours before the final transmission. By 7 in the evening, the ship was sailing with a compromised forward section, blind without its radar, in seas that had continued to build throughout the day. If the Three Sisters formation struck in those conditions, the sequence of events that followed would have taken less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. The first wave drives the bow down. The second holds it there. The third pushes the submerged bow forward and down at an angle the hull cannot sustain. The structural members along the keel, already stressed beyond their design limits by hours of hogging and sagging in steep waves, fail catastrophically. The ship breaks. Both sections continue moving forward under their own momentum, the stern section riding over the bow section and striking the lake floor first, which is why investigators found it upside down with its propeller pointing toward the surface. The bow section, heavier with its cargo of taconite, drove itself 15 feet into the sediment. From the perspective of anyone standing on the deck of the Edmund Fitzgerald at 7:14 in the evening, there would have been no warning that distinguished this moment from the previous 8 hours of violent storm conditions. The ship had been struck by heavy waves all day. It had listed. It had taken on water. It had continued sailing. And then, in the span of a single breath, the deck was not there anymore. The water was. No one reached for a life jacket because there was no interval between sailing and sinking in, which reaching for a life jacket was possible. The enclosed lifeboats required time and mechanical action to deploy. The inflatable life raft required a conscious decision and physical effort to release from its bracket. The survival suits, stored below decks, required a crew member to leave their post, descend a ladder, open a locker, and don equipment. None of those actions could be completed in seconds. None of them were. The cork life preservers that floated to the surface had not been grabbed. They had been torn from their brackets by the force of the water as it came over the deck. Morgan Clark, watching from the bridge of the Anderson 10 miles behind, saw the radar return vanish and understood immediately that something had gone wrong. What he could not have understood, what took investigators years and multiple expeditions to piece together, was that by the time the signal disappeared from his screen, the Edmund Fitzgerald was already on the bottom. The radar return did not fade as a sinking ship settled slowly into the water. It cut off abruptly because the vessel had ceased to be a surface object between one antenna sweep and the next. The Anderson's crew spent the night searching. They found the crushed lifeboat. They found the unopened life raft canister. They found cork rings and pieces of wood. They did not find 29 men. They did not find a single body, and they would not. Not that night, not in the weeks that followed, not in the decades since. Here is what the record confirms, stripped of theory and legend. On the morning of November 9th, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, carrying 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, crewed by 29 men under the command of Captain Ernest McSorley, a mariner with 44 years of experience on the Great Lakes. By mid-afternoon of November 10th, the ship had sustained damage to its ballast vents and was listing slightly to one side. At 7:10 in the evening, McSorley transmitted his final radio communication. At 7:15, the Fitzgerald vanished from the Anderson's radar without a distress call, without a Mayday, without a single survival action performed by any member of its crew. The wreck was located the following spring in 530 feet of water, broken in two, its bow buried 15 feet into the lake floor, its stern upside down. No body has ever been recovered. The Canadian government has designated the site a maritime grave and prohibited any disturbance of the wreck. The version of events most consistent with all of the physical evidence is neither the Coast Guard's hatch cover theory nor the Lake Carriers Association's shoal grounding argument alone, but a sequence that likely incorporated elements of both, accelerated and made fatal by the specific physics of Lake Superior in storm conditions. The most plausible reconstruction is this. The Fitzgerald sustained hull stress and possibly a partial grounding near 6 Fathom Shoal during the afternoon, damaging ballast systems and beginning a slow, manageable flooding of forward compartments. McSorley's pump reports and his list acknowledgement at 3:30 are consistent with this. The ship continued sailing because the flooding was not yet critical, and because turning broadside to the seas in those conditions would have been more dangerous than pressing forward. By evening, hours of hogging and sagging in steep, short wavelength Lake Superior waves had stressed the hull beyond its design tolerance. The forward section, already lower in the water than normal and carrying compromised ballast, was vulnerable to any sudden additional loading. The Three Sisters formation, or a functionally equivalent sequence of steep, closely spaced waves, struck the weakened bow and drove it under before the hull could recover. The keel failed. The ship broke. The entire sequence, from the moment the bow went under to the moment both hull sections struck the lake floor, almost certainly took less than 90 seconds. What makes this reconstruction particularly difficult to argue against is that it requires no single catastrophic failure. No one hatch cover suddenly giving way, no one moment of negligence by the crew. It requires only the accumulation of manageable problems over the course of a day, each individually survivable, combining under conditions of exceptional severity into an outcome that was not. The Fitzgerald was not sunk by a mistake. It was sunk by arithmetic. By the time the arithmetic resolved, there was no interval left in which any human action could have changed the answer. In the months after the sinking, the American Bureau of Shipping revised its inspection standards for hatch cover fastenings on Great Lakes bulk freighters. The number of required clamps per cover was increased. New gasket specifications were issued. Inspection intervals were shortened. These changes were described in official communications as precautionary updates, not as admissions that the previous standards had been inadequate. The language was careful. The implication was not. Every shipping company operating on the Great Lakes understood that the industry had been sailing with equipment standards that the worst storm in decades had just demonstrated were insufficient. The Lake Carriers Association continued to advocate for the shoal grounding theory for years. Its argument was partly technical and partly economic. If hatch cover failure was the cause, the liability implications for vessel owners were significant. If shoal grounding was the cause, the responsibility shifted toward navigation error by the Fitzgerald's crew, men who were dead and could not testify. The families of the 29 crew members challenged this framing. Several pursued legal action. The settlements reached in those cases were conducted under confidentiality agreements. The terms were never made public. The wreck itself became a source of conflict of a different kind. In 1994, a private expedition recovered the ship's bell from the stern section and brought it to the surface. The bell, which bore the ship's name, was restored and placed on display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Whitefish Point, Michigan, close to where the storm had been at its most intense when the Fitzgerald went down. A replica bell was lowered to the wreck site in its place. At the museum, every November 10th, the original bell is rung 29 times, once for each member of the crew. The names are read aloud. The bell rings. The lake, visible through the museum's windows, offers no comment. Gitche Gumi, the Ojibwe name for Lake Superior, translates roughly as the Great Sea. The indigenous people who named it understood something about its character that the engineering specifications of 1958 did not account for. That a body of water, this large and this cold, operates by rules that do not bend to accommodate the vessels crossing it. The near-freezing temperature of the lake's deep water inhibits bacterial activity. Bodies do not decompose in the way they would in warmer water. They do not rise. The 29 men of the Edmund Fitzgerald remain where they came to rest in the sediment at 530 feet, held there not by any mystery, but by the straightforward physics of cold, deep, still water. The lake does not return its dead because the lake's biology does not permit it. The legend and the science, in this case, arrive at the same place. The question that the official record has never fully answered is not what sank the Edmund Fitzgerald. The physics, assembled carefully from the wreck survey, the wave data, the radar logs, and the metallurgical analysis, describes a plausible and coherent sequence. The question the record has never answered is what the industry knew, and when, about the adequacy of the hatch cover standards on Great Lakes bulk freighters, and why those standards were not revised before November 10th, 1975, rather than after. The inspection reports existed. The engineering studies on wave-induced hull stress in enclosed water bodies existed. The modification records for vessels lengthened beyond their original structural specifications existed. They were in filing cabinets in offices in Cleveland and Detroit and Washington. If all the evidence existed beforehand, who decided it was not yet someone's responsibility?